What are you even doing here? The voice cut through the humid morning air like a blade, comes from someone who mistakes rank for wisdom. Technical sharp with the kind of dismissive authority that only Sergeant Morrison stood with his arms crossed, his perfectly pressed uniform reflecting the early sunlight streaming across the flight line at Ramstein Air Base. His eyes were fixed on the figure kneeling beside the massive landing gear of the C-130 Hercules, a man who seemed utterly out of place among the sleek machinery and bustling activity of one of the most important airlift operations in the world. The old man didn't look up. His weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he examined the hydraulic fitting, his movements economical and practiced. He wore simple coveralls, faded blue and soft from years of use, with patches of oil stains that told the story of countless hours spent elbow-deep in aircraft systems. His hair was silver white, thinning on top, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent decades squinting into the sun and breathing the metallic tang of aviation fuel. Morrison took a step closer, his boots clicking on the concrete with military precision. "This is a restricted maintenance area," he announced loudly, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. "Active duty personnel only. You need to move along, sir. We have a situation here that requires actual expertise." The situation Morrison referred to was indeed serious. The C-130, tail number 87-9283, had been grounded for 3 days with a complex hydraulic failure that had stumped 2 separate maintenance teams. The aircraft was scheduled to carry critical medical supplies to a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, part of a humanitarian mission that couldn't afford delays. The pressure was mounting from command, and Morrison, as the senior NCO on duty, was feeling every ounce of that pressure. Behind him, a small crowd of younger airmen watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. They had all heard Morrison's increasingly frustrated radio calls to higher headquarters, his voice growing tighter with each passing hour as diagnostic tests came back inconclusive and replacement parts failed to solve the problem. The aircraft remained stubbornly grounded, its cargo bay empty, its mission unfulfilled. The old man finally straightened up, his movements slow and deliberate. He brushed his hands on a clean rag he pulled from his pocket, then turned to face Morrison with eyes that were pale blue and remarkably calm. "I'm Walter Hayes," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had no need to raise it. "I'm here to fix your airplane." Morrison's face flushed red beneath his regulation haircut. He gestured toward the massive aircraft with a sweep of his arm. "This is a C-130J, Super Hercules," he said, his voice rising with each word. "It's a $100 million aircraft with integrated avionics systems that require specialized training and security clearances. You can't just wander over here and start poking around. Where's your badge? Where's your work order? Who authorized your presence on this flight line?" Walter reached into his chest pocket and produced a laminated card, holding it out without comment. Morrison snatched it, his eyes scanning the information with growing confusion. The clearance level was higher than his own, but the identification seemed to be from some civilian contractor he'd never heard of. The photo matched the man standing before him, but it was clearly old, showing a much younger face with dark hair and sharp features. "This has to be expired," Morrison said, turning the card over in his hands as if expecting it to dissolve. He squinted at the fine print, looking for an expiration date that would give him grounds to have the man removed. When he found none, his frustration only deepened. Walter waited patiently, his gaze drifting past Morrison to the aircraft itself. From where he stood, he could see the telltale signs of the hydraulic problem that had everyone stumped. The slight discoloration on the fuselage near the main landing gear, the way the flaps hung at an odd angle, the subtle pooling of fluid on the concrete below. It was a pattern he recognized, a signature written in the language of mechanical failure that he had learned to read over the course of 5 decades working on aircraft. The memory hit him suddenly, as they sometimes did. He wasn't standing on the pristine concrete of Ramstein anymore. He was 25 years old, crouched in a muddy revetment in Southeast Asia, working by flashlight on a C-130 that had taken ground fire. The hydraulic lines were shredded, the landing gear was jammed, and the crew chief was bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his arm. They had to get the aircraft airworthy before dawn, before the next wave of supply runs began. Failure wasn't an option. It never was. The young Walter had worked through the night, rerouting hydraulic lines with salvaged parts, jury-rigging systems that weren't meant to be jury-rigged. When the sun came up, the aircraft flew. It carried ammunition to a besieged firebase, medical supplies to a field hospital, and hope to men who desperately needed it. That was the night Walter learned that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. "Sir," Morrison's voice snapped Walter back to the present. "I asked you a question. What contractor are you with? What company sent you here?" Walter folded the laminated card and slipped it back into his pocket. "I'm not with a company," he said quietly. "I'm here because someone called me. Someone who knows that this aircraft needs to fly today, and that your teams have run out of ideas." The implication hung in the air like diesel exhaust. Morrison's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson that matched the warning lights on the grounded aircraft. He turned to address the small crowd of airmen who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "This is exactly what's wrong with the modern Air Force," he announced, his voice carrying across the flight line. "Everyone thinks they're an expert. Everyone thinks they can waltz in here and solve problems that trained professionals can't handle." He turned back to Walter, his finger jabbing the air between them. "I've got 20 years in the Air Force, old man. I've worked on everything from F-16 to B-52. I've deployed to 3 different theaters and supervised maintenance on aircraft worth more than your house. So don't stand there and tell me that you, some random civilian with a suspicious ID card, are going to solve a problem that my teams can't figure out." Walter listened to the tirade without changing expression. When Morrison finished, the silence stretched for several long seconds, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on other parts of the base. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire group. "Sergeant," he said, using Morrison's rank with a casual familiarity that somehow made it sound both respectful and dismissive. "I've been working on aircraft since before you were born. I've seen every failure mode, every system malfunction, every impossible situation that can ground an aircraft. And I've learned something that you can't get from manuals or training courses or 20 years of following procedures." He paused, his pale eyes meeting Morrison's glare without flinching. "I've learned to listen to what the aircraft is trying to tell me. Your airplane is talking to you right now. The question is, are you hearing what it's saying?" The words settled over the group like a challenge, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Morrison seemed to hesitate. There was something about the old man's quiet confidence. Something in the way he spoke about the aircraft as if it were a living thing rather than a collection of systems and components. Behind Morrison, one of the younger airmen shifted nervously. Airman First Class Rodriguez had been part of both maintenance teams that had failed to diagnose the hydraulic problem. She had watched senior technicians with decades of experience scratch their heads over diagnostic readouts that made no sense. She had seen master sergeants call manufacturer representatives who offered theories but no solutions. The aircraft remained grounded, and with each passing hour, the mission became more critical. Rodriguez found herself studying the old man more carefully. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself, that reminded her of her grandfather, a mechanic who had worked on aircraft during the Korean War. Her grandfather had possessed that same quiet certainty, that ability to look at a machine and see beyond the surface to the heart of the problem. She had learned more about engines sitting in his garage as a child than she had in her first year of technical training. Morrison was still talking, his voice growing louder as he tried to reassert his authority. "You want to know what your problem is," he said, pointing at Walter. "You think because you're old that makes you wise. You think because you've been around longer, you know more than the rest of us. But this isn't your grandfather's Air Force anymore. These systems are computerized, digitized, integrated in ways that require modern knowledge and current certifications." Walter reached into his tool bag, a simple canvas satchel that looked like it had survived several wars. From it, he withdrew a small electronic device, no bigger than a smartphone but clearly custom-built. Its case was machined aluminum, worn smooth by years of handling, and its display showed readings that none of the airmen recognized. He turned it on with a soft click, and immediately the screen began displaying data streams that seemed to map the aircraft's systems in real time. "What is that thing?" Morrison demanded, his authority wavering for the first time. "That's not standard diagnostic equipment. Where did you get it?" Walter ignored the question. He walked slowly around the landing gear, the device in his hand chirping softly as it collected data. His movements were methodical, purposeful, like a doctor examining a patient. He paused at certain points, holding the device closer to specific components, his eyes narrowing as he read displays that told him stories the standard diagnostics had missed. The hydraulic failure wasn't what everyone thought it was. The symptoms pointed to a pressure loss in the main system. But Walter's device was reading something different. There was a resonance pattern in the hydraulic pumps, a subtle vibration that was creating microscopic stress fractures in the line connections. It wasn't a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. It was a progressive degradation that would only get worse under operational stress. More importantly, it was fixable, not with replacement parts or major overhauls, but with a simple adjustment that would eliminate the resonance and allow the existing components to function properly. It was the kind of solution that came from understanding not just how systems were supposed to work, but how they actually worked in the real world, under real conditions, with real wear patterns and real environmental stresses. The device beeped twice, and Walter nodded to himself. He looked up at Morrison, who was watching with a mixture of suspicion and growing unease. "Your hydraulic pumps are out of phase," he said simply. "They're fighting each other instead of working together. It's creating a harmonic vibration that's degrading your line connections faster than they can self-seal." Morrison stared at him. "That's impossible. Those pumps are synchronized by the flight computer. They can't be out of phase." Walter smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It was a small, sad expression that held decades of experience with the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually did. "Computer says they're synchronized," he agreed. "But the computer is measuring electrical synchronization, not mechanical synchronization. There's a lag in one of the pump motor 6, but enough to throw off the mechanical, probably from bearing wear that's still within acceptable tolerances according to your diagnostic timing." He held up his device. "This measures actual flow rates and pressure waves, not just electrical signals. Your standard diagnostics can't see the problem because they're not looking for it." Rodriguez stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her respect for the chain of command. "How do you fix it without replacing the pumps?" Walter turned to her, recognizing something in her question that the others had missed. She wasn't challenging him or trying to prove him wrong. She genuinely wanted to understand. "You adjust the timing on the secondary pump motor," he said. "Advance it by about 3 degrees. It's a software adjustment, but it has to be done manually because the flight computer won't let you make changes outside of normal parameters." "But if we do that," Morrison interjected, his voice strained, "we'll void the warranty on the entire hydraulic system. We'll be outside of technical manual procedures. If something goes wrong, if there's an incident, careers will end." Walter nodded slowly. That was always the dilemma, the choice between following procedures that weren't working and taking responsibility for solutions that fell outside the approved methods. It was a choice he had faced countless times over the years, and it never got easier. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that lives depended on aircraft being airworthy, the understanding that sometimes the right answer wasn't the authorized answer. He thought about the humanitarian mission waiting to be flown, about the medical supplies sitting in the cargo bay, about the people on the other end of that flight who were counting on help that might never come if the aircraft remained grounded. He thought about all the times he had faced similar choices, all the aircraft he had returned to service using methods that weren't in any manual, all the missions that had been completed because someone was willing to take responsibility for doing what worked instead of what was approved. The young airman, Rodriguez, was still watching him with that same curiosity. She reminded him of himself at that age, hungry to understand not just the procedures, but the principles behind them. She was the future of aviation maintenance, if she could survive the bureaucracy long enough to learn what really mattered. How long would it take, she asked quietly, to make the adjustment? Walter checked his watch. 20 minutes to access the motor control unit. Maybe 10 minutes to make the adjustment and verify it's working. Another 10 minutes to run a full system check and button everything back up. 40 minutes, Rodriguez said, looking at Morrison. The medical supply mission doesn't leave for another 2 hours. We could have it airworthy with time to spare. Morrison's face was a mask of internal conflict. Every regulation, every procedure, every lesson from 20 years of military service told him to refuse. But every practical instinct, every understanding of what the mission required, told him to let the old man try. The decision hung in the air like the scent of jet fuel, heavy and unavoidable. Morrison's jaw worked silently as he weighed his options. Behind him, the small crowd of airmen had grown larger. Word was spreading across the flight line that something unusual was happening at the grounded Hercules. Maintenance chiefs from other squadrons had begun to wander over, drawn by the sight of an unfamiliar civilian arguing with Morrison. Among them was Master Sergeant Kim Valdez, a 28-year veteran who had seen her share of impossible situations. She had been working on aircraft since the days when diagnostic equipment consisted of a flashlight and a good ear. She watched Walter from a distance, noting the way he moved around the aircraft, the casual familiarity with which he handled his custom device, the quiet confidence that radiated from his every gesture. Valdez had worked alongside men like Walter before, back in the early days of her career when the Air Force was transitioning from the old ways to the new. They were a dying breed, the mechanics who could feel what was wrong with an aircraft before any computer could diagnose it. They worked by instinct and experience, guided by an understanding of machines that went deeper than technical manuals and troubleshooting flowcharts. She stepped forward, her presence causing the younger airmen to unconsciously straighten their postures. "Sergeant Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of nearly 3 decades in uniform. "What's the situation here?" Morrison turned, relief evident on his face at the arrival of someone with even more seniority. "Master Sergeant, this civilian claims he can fix the hydraulic problem on 8283. He wants to make unauthorized modifications to the pump motor timing. I've been trying to explain that we can't deviate from technical manual procedures." Valdez looked past Morrison to Walter, who had returned to his examination of the landing gear assembly. She watched him for a full minute, taking in the methodical way he worked, the precision of his movements, the fact that he seemed completely unbothered by the growing crowd of uniformed personnel watching his every move. "Sir," she called out to Walter, "what's your assessment?" Walter looked up from his device, his pale eyes meeting hers across the concrete. "The hydraulic pumps are fighting each other instead of working together," he said simply. "It's creating a resonance that's degrading the line connections. The computer can't see it because it's measuring the wrong parameters." Valdez nodded slowly. She had encountered similar problems before, subtle issues that fell between the cracks of standard diagnostic procedures. "How certain are you of the diagnosis?" Walter held up his device, its screen showing waveform patterns that looked like the heartbeat of the aircraft itself. 95%, he said. "The remaining 5% is always reserved for the possibility that the aircraft will surprise you. They usually do." For the first time since the confrontation began, Valdez smiled. It was a small expression, but it carried the weight of decades spent learning that machines had their own personalities, their own ways of communicating with those who knew how to listen. She had heard similar words from her first supervisor, an old-school crew chief who had taught her that troubleshooting was as much art as science. "What would you need to make the repair?" she asked. Walter gestured toward a maintenance stand positioned near the aircraft's belly, access to the motor control unit in the aft equipment bay, a laptop with the right software interface, maybe a witness to verify the adjustment is within safe parameters. Morrison stepped between them, his face flushed with frustration. "Master Sergeant, with all due respect, we can't authorize a civilian contractor to make unauthorized modifications to a flight-critical system. The liability alone would end all our careers. If this aircraft has an incident because of a non-standard repair, the investigation will destroy everyone involved." Valdez looked at him with the patience of someone who had heard similar concerns countless times over the years. She understood his position. In the modern military, following procedures was often more important than solving problems. Covering yourself was more valued than taking risks, even calculated ones. It was a mindset that kept people safe, but also kept aircraft grounded when they should be flying. "Sergeant Morrison," she said quietly, "what's the current status of the manufacturer support for this problem?" Morrison consulted his tablet, scrolling through messages and technical bulletins. "Engineering support says they can have a field service representative here in 72 hours. Replacement pump assemblies are available, but the earliest delivery would be next week. The parts cost alone would be somewhere around $40,000. And the medical supply mission?" Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly. "Critical. Command has been calling every hour asking for status updates. The supplies are needed for a field hospital that's expecting casualties from a training exercise. If we can't get them there today, they'll have to source the materials locally, assuming they're even available." Valdez turned back to Walter, who had been listening to the exchange without comment. His device continued to chirp softly as it monitored the aircraft's systems, painting an electronic picture of the machine's condition that was invisible to everyone else. "Sir," she said, addressing Walter with a formality that made Morrison's eyes narrow, "what's your background? How long have you been working on aircraft?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past the assembled group to the horizon where other aircraft were taking off and landing in the steady rhythm of military aviation. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back through decades of service. 52 years, he said quietly. "I started working on aircraft when the C-130 was still new, when we fixed things with salvaged parts and determination, because that's all we had. I've seen every variant, every modification, every way these machines can fail, and every way they can be saved." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the tense quiet of confrontation, but the respectful pause that comes when people realize they're in the presence of something rare. Walter Hayes wasn't just a mechanic. He was a living repository of knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual, a bridge between the old Air Force and the new. Valdez made her decision with the swift certainty of someone who had learned to trust her instincts. "Do it," she said, looking directly at Walter. "Rodriguez, you assist him. Morrison, you document everything for the record. If this works, we all learn something. If it doesn't, the responsibility is mine." What followed was a masterclass in aircraft maintenance that would be talked about on the flight line for years to come. Walter worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed similar repairs in far more challenging conditions. His hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, making minute adjustments to systems that most technicians would never dare to touch outside of prescribed procedures. Rodriguez watched everything, asking questions that showed she understood not just what Walter was doing, but why he was doing it. She was learning lessons that weren't in any textbook, insights that could only come from decades of experience working on aircraft in conditions where failure meant more than just paperwork and delays. 37 minutes after he began, Walter closed the equipment bay access panel and stepped back. The aircraft's systems hummed with a subtle change that was immediately apparent to anyone who knew how to listen. The resonance was gone, replaced by the smooth, synchronized operation of hydraulic pumps working in perfect harmony. The post-repair checks revealed what Walter had promised. All systems showed green across the board. The hydraulic pressure held steady under load testing. The aircraft was not just airworthy, but better than it had been in months.